Internal cultural differences among blacks have long been extreme, ranging from such things as urbanization, education, and regional distribution to rates of crime, economic achievement, and general acculturation to the norms of the surrounding society.
There was a relatively small group of people that, out of ignorance, still identified themselves as black people who had a very different culture than the real black people, right? And so these differences in culture had an impact on how much crime they committed, right? Their educational achievements, and also the way that they fit in with the society around them. And so culture, it involves things like food, appearance, mannerisms, right? The attitudes towards relationships, children, and education, right? A group's values and their priorities, right? And other similar areas which impact the way that a group approaches the game of life. And so let's look a little bit more into this history of these cultural differences between these blacks after slavery. And to do this, we have to continue reading in the book right here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell, to see if we can get some understanding.
Historically, the most fundamental difference for many generations was between those blacks who were slaves and those who were free. There were not just isolated individual blacks who were culturally more advanced than other blacks, but whole classes of blacks who had achieved cultural levels that most blacks would not achieve until many generations later.
So from the start, we see that the difference between these two groups initially was that one group was free and the other group was a slave, right? And so the free group, they were able to be more culturally advanced in certain areas than the slave group, right? As we should expect, right? When one group doesn't have the same opportunity to develop a progressive culture as the other one does. And so the free group, they had a head start, right? And they were able to achieve things that the slaves were unable to achieve until many generations later, right? Okay, we understand this part. Let's keep going.
The size of the free black population increased after the United States came into existence as an independent nation, as the ideology of freedom associated with the American Revolution led most northern states to abolish slavery. And even in the South, enough white slave owners freed their slaves to cause the free black population there to nearly double and then redouble between 1790 and 1810. Both the regional distribution and the degree of urbanization of free and enslaved blacks differed greatly. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the cotton plantations of the Deep South began to draw slaves away from upper South states like Virginia and North Carolina toward more southerly states like Mississippi and Alabama, sometimes as individuals sold down the river and often as part of the whole plantations that relocated. Thus, the geographic center of the black population moved steadily southwestward at an average of about 50 miles per decade. Meanwhile, the free persons of color were moving in the directly opposite direction.
They were going in the opposite direction, which is northeast, right? And remember that the North differed greatly from the South in their culture, right? And so real quick, the name free person of color, this was given to free Negroes by whites at that time, right? And so it talks about this in a book called Black Masters by Dr. Michael P. Johnson. And so again, we still have these people being labeled and identified by another group of people, right? Which is completely unacceptable for people in the free world today, right? So let's keep going.
While more than 90% of the antebellum black population lived in the South, the free persons of color were evenly divided between the states of the North and the South, and within the South, they tended to leave the Deep South and gravitate toward the region's less oppressive places farther north.
So these free people of color were situating themselves in less stressful and oppressive environments than the environments of the enslaved blacks, right? Which is obviously a smart thing to do when you're trying to become established.
The difference in geographic distribution was so extreme that in 1860, there were more free blacks living in the city of Washington alone than in the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia combined, these states having huge concentrations of slaves. The slave and the free also differed greatly in urbanization. While most black slaves worked in rural settings, by 1860, the free persons of color were more urbanized than even the white population. There were cultural consequences to these historic and geographic differences.
The question we should have is, what was one of these cultural consequences?
While the vast majority of slaves could neither read nor write, the census of 1850 showed that most free persons of color were literate. But it would be half a century later, 2 generations after emancipation, before the same would be true of the black population as a whole.
The free people of color, they learned to read and write half a century before the slaves did. What does this mean? It means that they were able to accumulate much more knowledge, and then more importantly, apply that knowledge to improve their position in society, right? And so what reading did is it also afforded them the opportunity to expand their worldview, right? By considering ideas put on paper by other people from other backgrounds, right? So a head start in reading was a huge advantage.
It would be 1940 before the black population as a whole became as urbanized as the free persons of color were in 1850. The cultural head starts of this segment of the black population had enduring consequences.
Let's see some more.
The descendants of the antebellum free persons of color remained predominant among black leaders in many fields, well into the 20th century, and they included W.E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Fortune, Charles Weddell Chestnut, Thurgood Marshall, John Hope Franklin, and many others. Most black holders of doctoral degrees in the middle of the 20th century, as well as most Negroes working in the professions in the nation's capital at that time, were by all indications descendants of the antebellum free persons of color, a group that was never more than 14% of the black population.
You see that? And so notice that this was a very small group making up only about 14% according to Dr. Thomas Sowell, right? But this group was highly influential and established in leadership positions. And so what does this tell us? And what does this demonstrate? It shows us that you don't need to have a lot of people to have a successful group, right? You only need a small number of people, of the right people, with the right mindset, right? Then you can make magic happen.
As a group, the free persons of color also differed from the slaves in racial mixture.
Uh-oh, let's see where this is going.
As in most of the Western Hemisphere, freed slaves were often the offspring of those who freed them, and the adults were more often female than male.
That means they were descendants of people who have pinkish orange skin color and call themselves white people. They were lighter in complexion, right? Which also meant that they had more opportunity in that color graded world that the colonizers set up during that time, right? Which is a world that we, the Earthpoise people of the free world, do not support and do not participate in.
While only 8% of slaves met the stringent U.S. Census requirement of half or more white ancestry to be classified as mulatto, 37% of the free persons of color did. This is not to say that all the others in either category were of pure African ancestry.
Because that would not be true, right? There are not any people, at least to my knowledge, that have slave ancestry and are of pure African ancestry that live in America, right, today, right? Most of these people are primarily mixed with European ancestry, and some of them have Native American or Asian ancestry, right? But none of them have pure African ancestry, right? And so when I took my DNA test, my results were about 65% African, 28% European, 5.5% Native American, and about 1% Asian. And so it'll vary a lot depending on the person and their background.
But there were very noticeable skin color differences between the more acculturated descendants of those freed before the Civil War and those freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. The noticeably greater success of the former was often attributed to their white ancestry, both by whites and by some of the Negro elite themselves.
This is when Western society was in a vast state of ignorance when it linked skin color to intelligence and ability, right? And we can see that both the whites and the black elites, they were both agents for this idea.
Moreover, the later rise of other blacks to similar levels of achievement undermines the biological explanation of these internal differences among blacks.
When people with richer skin color started to succeed in similar areas as the people with lighter skin, it became obvious that this success was not dependent on having light skin from a European, right? But what it did show was that if people make similar efforts and they have similar opportunities, then we can expect similar results, right? There's no mystery in this at all.
The point here is that cultural differences led to striking socioeconomic differences among blacks, as they did among whites. In both races, those who lived within the redneck culture lagged far behind those who did not.
Understand this clearly, that if you're a person of any skin color and you get raised by the backwood rednecks or the inner city ghetto black folks, then you're going to have a much higher chance of lagging behind in many important areas than a person who's not raised by them, right? This is just the reality of the situation, right? It's the elephant in the room that many people are trying to avoid, right? But this is the reality of the situation. That's why we're facing it head on right now.
The point here is that the descendants of free persons of color had a cultural history that served them better than the cultural history of the descendants of slaves, even after the abolition of slavery ended differences in their legal status.
The descendants of the slaves, they had a much longer time being chained up with the physical and the mental shackles. And so just like them, many of their descendants are still wandering around right now in the dark to this very day, right? Some of them, they're trying to look for some light, right? But many of them, they're not even close to being ready at all, and they're not even looking, right? And so hopefully these videos here are helping you find some light, right? So you can find that ladder, and then you can jump on it and climb rung by rung out of the pit, and you can see what it's like to get into the free world, right? Where life is much better and it makes much more sense, right? And so this is the end of part 7 commentary on the book here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. And so my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.